Today, I have the great pleasure of speaking with an icon in our industry. Elliott Ferguson is the president and CEO of Destination DC and the chair of the board of US Travel. We're going to speak about three main topics. The first is how DMOs can help business owners navigate what's going on and what is coming after the pandemic. Second, we're going to speak about diversity, equality, and inclusion and the leading role that Elliott has taken on this extremely important topic. And last but not least, as his role of chair of US Travel and what's coming next for our industry. Enjoy listening to Elliott. Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Business of Meetings podcast. And today I am extremely happy and honored to speak with a longtime friend, somebody who's extremely well known in the industry. He is the president and CEO of Destination DC, the current national chair of the board of directors of US Travel, Elliott Ferguson. Elliott, how are you?
Eric, good to see you, my friend, and thanks for the introduction and the opportunity to be on today. I am doing okay. Thanks for asking. How about you?
Yeah, well, no complaint. You know, as they say, I love to quote Winston Churchill, said, when you go through hell, keep going. So...
But we're going to do the best we can not to go to hell. So
that's for sure. And quite
right,
frankly, I'm grateful everybody's in good health. And, that's the most important. Looking forward to hopefully the vaccine rolling out sooner rather than later and being able to, again, be face-to-face and enjoy all the great things that we do in our industry.
I tell you, man, we're very optimistic with the vaccine and, of course, with the new leadership in the White House and all the right things that we're saying domestically and globally, and hopefully we'll be able to, it's not going to be in 3 to 6 months, but at least by six months from now, we'll be looking at this through a different lens. And, so I remain optimistic.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And it's phenomenal what has been done with science and much faster than any previous pandemic in the history of mankind. But, one thing at the time, as they say, one thing I didn't know about you is actually, you've been 20 years with Destination DC, but before that you were in Atlanta and you actually started in Savannah.
Yes.
And if we can go back just for a few minutes in time, what decided you to come to the industry? How did you join the industry?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I was, this was in the late 80s, early 90s. You have to think back before all the technology that we have the benefit of having at our fingertips. I was working in Savannah. I went to high school and college, Savannah State University in Savannah. And, I planned to move back to California. But I got an opportunity with an organization, the Savannah Economic Development Authority, that focused really on bringing business to Savannah and Georgia. Industry relocating or expanding, which is economic development. And the guy that ran the Convention and Visitors Bureau was on the board of that organization. And he stopped me one day and said, hey, I'd love to talk to you about, what we do and see if there's some opportunity there for you to come join us. And my first reaction is, I don't want to do bus tours or work in a hotel or a restaurant. What's wrong with you? I went to college. Now, young, naive, and not really with the wherewithal to do the research. I avoided this guy for 6 months.
Wow.
And I don't know, thank goodness he did not give up on me. But what he saw was, as he told me, was that back then there was not a lot of diversity in the industry, ironically, as we deal with that today. He liked what I did as he was a board member, and he thought we would work well together. And after 6 months thinking about it, doing a little bit more research, learning more about what the organization did, lo and behold, I joined and said, I'll do this for a little bit and see if I like it. 30 plus years later, I'm still doing it, man.
That's awesome. I remember when I started my company, actually when I joined the industry and then soon after started my company, I remember my friends telling me, with your business degree, what are you going to do? I say, yeah, I have no idea. Incentive travel, sales meeting, product launch. It's amazing. So now you're obviously at the helm of the one of the biggest, if not the biggest Destination Management Organization, DMOs as we call it, or Convention Visitors Bureau. Basically, you're at the helm of the association which tried to bring all the meetings, the conference and everything to DC. How has been the last 12 months for you, and how you see people navigating the whole situation?
Yeah, it's been, like everywhere in the world, there's no portion of the world that has not been affected by COVID. Arguably, places like New Zealand and Australia are in a different place, but we've all been dealing with this. And to your point, I moved to Washington, D.C. in December of 2001. And that was just a few months after 9/11, a few months after probably the most significant and tragic thing that happened on American soil as it pertains to terrorism in my lifetime and in my parents' lifetime in America. Mm-hmm. So it was an interesting time to, after 10 years in Atlanta, I love the city and everything else, decide to relocate. But, 9/11 was also the impetus for me laying in bed that night, like so many people did, and think about life and think about what I wanted and, mm-hmm. Felt like I could, I should be looking at my next opportunity. So, you factor in, December of 2001 will be 20 years. We've lived through, 9/11, sniper, anthrax, government shutdowns, at least 7 of them, and now this pandemic. And so we are accustomed to, unfortunately, things that have affected business travel and tourism to Washington, D.C. This has been the hardest, but, there's strength in numbers. And, all of my peers around the country, we're talking about recovery. But we went from a stage of denial, whereas we're like, oh, yeah, this is just going to stay in China like so many other diseases have globally, and we'll be fine, to the shock of when suddenly we were shut down, mm-hmm. to the stage of, quite frankly, just kind of like saddened and not knowing what to do, to, of course, a stage of being more proactive and looking towards the future, especially now that we have vaccines in place. So, we've been, we're also dealing with the fact that we've not been eligible for payroll protection through any of the other acts within the federal government until recently. Yeah. So fortunately, we're in there now, but, it's been very tough because we're an organization that relies on hotel tax and membership to pay our salaries and make up our budget, and neither of them existed. So it's been tough, but we've learned a lot about ourselves, and now we're at a point where we're looking towards the future, Eric.
So finally, the light at the end of the tunnel.
Light at the end of the tunnel, for sure.
And it's not a train coming full speed in the opposite direction.
You're absolutely right. I think about all the things I just referenced, and then, we had, of course, the January 6th insurrection in Washington, D.C., and there comes another litany of calls about safety in Washington. The reality at that point was that nobody was traveling anyway because they were dealing with a pandemic. But that is a global perspective with everyone looking at Washington, D.C., and, in the case of January 6th, scratching their heads and trying to figure out how in the world could that happen, but then trying to think wondering whether or not Washington is a safe destination. So it's been an interesting year, my friend.
Yeah, and also the perception globally. You're somebody who's well-traveled. I remember listening to you on a radio show in New Zealand, and then you have the, I don't know if you still have the partnership with Brussels.
We do.
Yeah,
we do.
So did you hear more about what was going on in Europe before it came here? And did you have some insights or what our industry would be facing?
Well, we heard a lot, but, it's, one thing I'll say that we need to work on as Americans is that we do have a sense of, oh, that will never happen here. There are, depending on where you travel in the world, there are different ways in which they look at the American spirit, some arrogance and other ways, but we do have that. And, again, I looked at it and thought about Ebola, thought about SARS, thought about other things that have affected the global community. And as we were learning about this happening in China, I was literally one of those people that did not think it could actually happen here. I actually I tested positive for COVID antibodies. And I vaguely remember before we were in shutdown mode, in March, the international trips that I went on, and not feeling my best, but just thinking, oh yeah, it's just, because of jet lag and just have a bad cold, only to learn months later going in for a exam and saying, just test me for the antibodies, finding out that I actually had the antibodies. And again, that's just, I hate to use the word arrogance, but I just never, it never resonated that something like COVID could shut down the American or global economy.
Yeah, the same way, totally the same thinking. And when you say Ebola, it reminded me as well, and linking that with how people travel or look at the news, and nothing to do with the US, but I remember when I still had my corporate event in Brussels, a corporate event company, I have a friend in Namibia who's organizing incentives. And if you remember, the Ebola outbreak was in the northwest of Africa, Liberia and Sierra Leone. And he told me the story of an incentive house in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, calling him and saying, Hilmar, should I be worried about Ebola? And he went, yes, absolutely. And she said, oh, really? Why? Because look at the map. The Netherlands are closer than we are. Yeah. And so people, sometimes they hear something, they don't see the location or start panicking. But anyway, we all facing that today. And now going back to your role as Destination DC, I know there's an amazing thing. Remember a few years ago reading about you can visit DC based on the Da Vinci Code. Is that right? There's a program that takes the book from Dan Brown and show it the different places in Washington. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And there was actually a tour in place that showed Washington through the eyes of those who followed the Dan Brown movies, especially the series that was done here in Washington, D.C. So absolutely.
Wow. I want to do that one day. That'd be fascinating.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I love to be on that tour with you when we're able to travel again.
Yes, with great pleasure.
Yeah.
Now one of the reasons also that I wanted to talk with you, it's about all the work you're doing about diversity, equality, and inclusion. You were talking about the fact there was a little diversity when the person from the board in Savannah approached you. I would guess that today it's a little bit better, but we're far from what it should be.
Yeah, and arguably, I would say it's slightly better because when I entered the industry in '92, there was one Black male that was the CEO of a DMO. Mm-hmm. He's actually still in the industry, Melvin Tennant. He's the CEO of Minneapolis.
Yes.
Minneapolis, but at the time he was in Oakland, California. And I did not necessarily look at it through the lens of me being here 30 years later. But I was very actively involved in the National Coalition of Black Meeting Planners, and realizing that there were there were opportunities and there was diversity at the lower level of the pyramid, if you will, mm-hmm. in our industry. As you went further up the pyramid, there were fewer and fewer opportunities. And as you look at 2021, we're a nation with 600 or 700 DMOs, and you've got less than 10 that are run by Black people, brown people, people of color, and females. So I think that there are still a lot of opportunities and a time for us to really look at it and dissect this through a different lens. And I'll tell you, Eric, last year was my wake-up call, if you will. I guess I had a lot of wake-up calls last year in terms mm-hmm. of realizing that, one, the pandemic and COVID could happen in America, and then two, realizing that I need to do more. I need to be more vocal. I need to, unlearn certain things. When I was coming up in the industry, finishing college in the 80s, wear a suit, stay in line, pay your dues, and then you will be able to reap the rewards later on in life. I'm former military. It was kind of in line with some of those teachings. And now I say to the younger generations, you need to be respectful. You need to learn your craft, but there's no such thing as waiting your turn. There's an opportunity for us to really look at this through a different lens. Diversity, equity, and inclusion they're extremely important to me. But, the Black Lives Matter movement resonated simply because of, as you watched the George Floyd murder and so many other murders, you sit there and you watch something like that. And as a Black man, I look at that and say that could have easily have been me, because if I got stopped for something in my age, I probably would have defended or said something, and you don't know what the outcome could be simply because of the color of your skin. And that's actually true. And I've gotten into a lot of philosophical conversations about people. Well, no, that wouldn't be you because you're different. And I'm like, no, my friend, when it's dark or if I'm stopped, they don't know me the way you know me. And so you cannot look at me and think that what happened to a George Floyd arguably could not happen to me. And then sharing examples, not as tragic as the outcome of a George Floyd, but examples of being targeted because I was Black or not. I won't say not being given opportunities, but being in positions and being in places, whereas because of the color of my skin, I was marginalized. Or people, the number of times I've walked into a room and people thought that I could not be Elliott Ferguson. One, it's an Irish name. And two, before I grew this gray beard, I looked younger than I actually am. So no one would ever think that I was Elliott Ferguson. And I saw that happen several times, and I allowed it to happen. And I think that the lesson now for me is to talk more about it, to engage people of all colors in white America, to get them to understand some of the disparaging ways of the Black community, even in 2021, that are tied to not only slavery, but Jim Crow laws and not able to get loans in banks in 2021. These things still exist, and have these conversations because they're extremely important.
And I would add to that also, it's a question of education, but not only obviously in the Black community. All the friends that I have since I moved to the US that are African-American have told me about the talk. And I sell that, I share that with my kids. I have 3 daughters. Usually when in my family and in Europe, when we'll have the talk with the kids, it was about sexual relations. And the talk is driving while Black when you're talking with the children. And so I think it's also an awareness, an education issue. And I don't know what you think about that, but it's obviously not in the African-American community, but it should be shared and known by everybody.
Eric, I totally agree with you. And I think that it's back to the mentality that I had in regards to the pandemic coming to America. Oh, no, it won't be here because, it's America, it won't happen. I think white people tend to not pay attention to these things because they're not Black. And equally as much, Black people don't talk about them because, to a large extent, they're very painful conversations. Secondly, you can be perceived as vulnerable. And there was a time in my career, if I were to talk the way I talk now, I probably wouldn't have a job because I would be disruptive or I'm not making people feel comfortable. And I think now more than ever, we do need to, if we really want to do better, and doing better is just not white people recognizing and understanding the plight of the Black community, but it's also, it's a two-way street, but it's also an opportunity, a day of reckoning in terms of understanding that, there's something totally wrong in 2021. We talked about me being chair of the U.S. Travel Association, which is coming to an end in this a couple of weeks, and walking into a room and being one of 2 Black people in a room. And, 9 years ago, I'm like, what's that like when you walk into the room and you're one of 2 white people walking into a room filled with Black people? But also representing an industry that I love and not seeing the diversity and seeing opportunities there to really have these conversations. And 9 years ago, probably being marginalized and, he's radical and combative and all the things that people want to label you as when you talk about things that make them feel uncomfortable. No, I think that's what we have to do. I think that 2020 taught us that we need to all do better. We all need to have conversations in terms of trying to understand a lot more about our community, because at the end of the day, we're all Americans.
Absolutely. And I'm almost American, so I can totally relate to that. Hopefully,
but you're so lovable. We don't, hey, it's the accent, it's the smile. You're such a great guy.
Yeah, right. Well, I have to tell you, when talking about, if you would have talked like that years ago, you would have been tagged as a radical and stuff like that. That resonates a lot with me, because back then, when I was a kid in my high school years, which started in Belgium in 7th grade, I was the only Jew in the class. And trust me, when it comes to discrimination and bullying and racism, that's something that resonates a lot with me. And so I would always speak up. As I share another conversation, I was 12 when a kid during the classroom, the teacher was speaking. They lean on me and then they say, "You just a F dirty Jew." And so me being very diplomatic, as you know, I just stood up, take his head and smash his head on the desk. It was called to the principal. But to your point, I'm not saying you have to be violent, but I never, ever, ever decided that day I'm never gonna not speak up. And so throughout the days, I know, being an entrepreneur, that cost me some business with some people. Always being, and to me, it's like you have to speak up. There is no selective indignation. And you're talking about Black Lives Matters. I'm the first one, as you know, to be very supportive. And I think we should be speaking again against people like Louis Farrakhan, who are targeting people like me, and be very conscious of, as you say, it's one America. And it's about time that people wake up and give opportunities to everyone without any discrimination, and just because of the quality of the people. But as you say, if you don't speak up, things are not going to happen.
No, you're absolutely right. And I totally agree with you. And I will say that most discrimination comes from ignorance. A lot of it comes from what we were taught. And, as I'm talking to, CEOs of companies, usually, mostly all white, and we're having these conversations, the things I said, one, because you're the CEO, the perception is you don't want to feel uncomfortable, nor do you want to come across as unknowledgeable on certain subjects. You need to be the authority because you're the CEO. I said, well, let me just tell you something. If you want to turn off the people that work for you, continue to go down that path. I said, because now we're in a phase of our careers, whereas, Generation X and millennials are now outnumbering. I was born in 65. I'm on the cusp of the greatest generation, shockingly. I don't feel it, but but we're the minority in the workforce. And so you're getting, your kids will be entering the workforce in a few years, and they're going to expect, because of the stories and the things in which you've experienced and things that perhaps they've experienced, things that they've seen, they're going to expect to see some diversity. They're going to demand it. And I'm like, and so those who continue to keep their heads in the sand and want to act like it's just a Black problem or a Jewish problem or it doesn't affect them, they're going to continue to be left behind. I mean, a good example, I just was on a Zoom and we were talking about what have we learned about Zooms in the virtual world. I'm like, those that were stuck in their ways and no, that's not what we want to do in terms of our meetings, and we'll always face-to-face is important, which I agree. Now, out of necessity, have now understood the importance of this because it's our only option in terms of communicating. So now they're changing their ways of thinking to say, well, now we need to include this. This is not going to replace face-to-face, but how can we go from 10,000 people in person with 5,000 people virtually? I'm like, that mindset has to exist as you're looking at races, as you're looking at women, as you're looking at LGBTQ community, as you're looking at people with disabilities.
Absolutely.
And the younger generations are going to expect that when they're looking at companies, or they're just not going to go work for you.
I have to tell you, I'm first of all, I agree 150% with you. And I'm very optimistic when I see my kids, when I see their friends and how they are reacting. The other one now is at UF, and how the friends that she has and the conversation she has, I'm very optimistic with the future for that.
I totally agree. I talked to one CEO, remain nameless, and it was a series of CEOs. But I said something to one of them. I said, I encourage you to go home and talk to your families about race relations. Ask them about what they perceive, how in the younger community, how woke you are in terms of what's happening in the community. And one called me like a week later, said, I was pessimistic about calling you. I'm embarrassed, but I had this, I thought about what you said, and I went home and I talked to my kids and my grandkids. And his kids are millennials and has a couple of grandkids. His kids said, "Oh yeah, Dad, you've always been racist. You've always made racist comments." And he was shocked because most people don't realize that we're talking about them when we're having these conversations, because they actually think that because they check a box and they have a person that focuses on diversity, equity, and inclusion in their company, that they're totally on board. Well, no, that person has no access to you, and they can't talk to you freely and in a way whereas you can understand how unaware you are, then you're shooting yourself in the foot. But the comments that I got from that person was that I had no idea that the things I said were racist. Mm-hmm. And so the point that I'm making is that sometimes people don't even realize when we're having these conversations, they could be in the audience and on Zoom and they're shaking their heads and they're agreeing with me, just like in church or in synagogue, everybody's agreeing, but then they go out and they just go back to their sinful ways. And I'm like, we're talking about you. Mm-hmm. We all need, black, white, whatever. We're talking to you about challenging yourself to be more purposeful with, with the conversation within your company. Look at the landscape of your company. Look at the board of directors. Look at all your marketing. And then understand that diverse companies actually are the most profitable. And they're the ones that normally come across as the places where people actually want to work. And in some cases, you're not on that list ever because you're in your one-dimensional world of doing business, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, absolutely. I had the immense luck to be part of a student organization called IESEC, AIESEC, which is now in over 160 countries in the world. And there was no discrimination on any basis. That was the fundamentals of the organization. And that changed my life. And that changed the life of everybody who went in that. So, and I'm not surprised, as you say, that the companies that are more diverse are those who are actually performing the best, as it should be. I can't wait for the moment, like Ellen DeGeneres said, when we will judge the people again by the type of car they're driving.
Well, if Ellen said it, it's got to be right. Yeah, you're right.
Exactly.
That is so funny. Exactly. That is hilarious.
So you said in few weeks, your role as chair of U.S. Travel is going to come to an end?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been 2 years. And, an interesting time to be the chair of the U.S. Travel Association.
Yeah. So what do you see in our industry coming? What is the hope? What is the change that people should be aware of? And especially, what is the strategy, the learning that business owners that own a business in our industry or who wants to start a business have to think about?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, as we deal with our own political and personal conscience in terms of Black Lives Matter, change of administration, once we continue to focus on those stressors, trying to homeschool and everything else everybody's trying to do, you get back to the fact that we're dealing with a pandemic and people are losing their lives. Mm-hmm. And so I think the primary thing is, I'm very appreciative of the direction that the Biden administration is going in making it a priority to focus on the pandemic first and foremost. Because if we don't, then we're not thinking the way we should be. And if we're looking at running a business, yes, we want to all rebound, but we recognize the fact that rebounding is tied to a vaccine and getting back in global travel, going back to normal. Mm-hmm. As we're looking at the short term, we're focusing on domestic markets simply because the international market cannot come to the United States. U.S. Travel Association is focusing on that, focusing on building relationships with it's like Groundhog's Day every 4 years or eight years, depending on the outcome of an election. You got a new slate of secretaries, a new cabinet, a new administration, and then of course changes in Congress. And you've got to make sure that you are getting them to understand the importance of this industry. And I think now more than ever, when there's no travel at all, people are paying attention to what's missing and how important this industry is. So U.S. Travel Association, Christine Duffy, CEO of Carnival Cruises, she's coming in as chair, should be focusing on making sure that U.S. Travel Association, with Roger Dow at the helm, is dealing with the priorities tied to recovery and making sure that, we, as a 501c6, we just got PPP funding for the first time with our former president signing the legislation. We need those dollars so we can get back on track, because we need to start promoting our destinations so that people can start traveling again. So, I will say that is kind of the outlier and the primary issue that U.S. Travel Association has been focusing on. Fortunately, we've done 2 webinars within DEI, within U.S. Travel Association that focused on diversity, but focused on it from the standpoint of being Black in America. And that was something that I'm very proud of, because we had over 2,000 people, Eric, on each of those Zooms.
Wow.
Whereas we had, people that you see within our industry that you respect and you know them very well, and then they share their experiences about being Black in America. My IMEX story, Eric, and you and I, we've been to IMEX in Frankfurt, and the couple of years ago I won an award. We won 2 awards at IMEX, and everybody coming up to me and congratulating me and saying, Americans never win awards at IMEX, and then we win 2, and then seconds later, somebody comes up and asks me to fill their glass of wine at that event.
Gosh.
And so my first inclination was, because everybody was same reaction as you, shocked. I literally just got off the stage, one of few Black people in that room. No servers were Black at all. This was a guy from Europe who all he saw was color. I had on the tuxedo, had my award in my hand, but that didn't matter. And, so my first inclination was to make the people around me feel good. No, it's okay. He's just not thinking right. But then I go back to my seat. My wife happened to be there because she knew about the award. I didn't. And I'm just deflated. I'm looking around the room and I'm smiling and I'm just saying, you just can't get away from this ever. And, but after last year, I said, I won't focus my attentions on trying to make people around me feel comfortable, because that was my first inclination, to play it off, to dumb it down, but also deal with it on my own terms, which is not right. I don't have to protect the guy, even though I wanted to give him his wine, all right, but I do need to make sure that people understand this is what we're referring to in terms of marginalized because of the color of your skin. So go back to U.S. Travel, I made it a priority to have these conversations, share these things, have others share their stories as well, as an opportunity for us to do better within our industry.
Good for you. I think to your point, it's first of all is the awareness, and the awareness comes with the education, and it takes a generation. I mean, you and I have seen it, are seeing it now with the next generation. It's finally working. It's different. They look at it in a different way. So that's very optimistic on that sense.
You're absolutely right. And we have to do it. We're the hospitality industry, for goodness sakes. We should be leading the way in terms of understanding people's cultural differences, but understanding that we're all human beings. We come from different backgrounds, but we should all, hospitality is all about being hospitable. So our industry, if we're going to walk the walk, we got to talk the talk. More than just, again, checking the box and saying, yes, well, I've got a person focusing on this issue without me, the Black CEO in a city that is predominantly Black, also challenging myself to see what I should be doing different in terms of how I market the city, challenging myself and my board to ask those questions, even though I tend to think that I probably am a little further along than most, I still got to do better myself.
Yeah, and all improvement from everybody.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time, Elliot, and sharing those stories. That's also what I always wanted to have a radio show, which is, the podcast is the closest thing to that, to be able to share those messages that are dear to my heart, and with people that have lived through it and opening eyes. That's very important.
I agree, Eric. And I think that if you had a radio show or podcast, you'd be great at it. You're one of those personalities that makes people open up, and you're very engaging. So, if this hospitality thing doesn't work out, you got something to fall back on.
Well, I've been thinking of that for the last 25 years. So, so my last question for today, if you don't mind, in 1 year and hopefully less than 1 year, but we will be meeting face to face with a bottle of champagne. What are we going to celebrate?
Well, I think we're gonna. I'd like to think that we're gonna really look back on lessons learned on so many different fronts. From this politics in America, God knows we've had a lot of lessons over the last 4 years and a couple of weeks into this year. We've dealt with a global pandemic, and we have not done it well in America. But as an industry, we're going to be focusing on rebounding and focusing on, again, those lessons learned and how can we build stronger relationships from a global perspective. I'm hoping that that's the case, and figuring out what does the meeting, what do meetings look like moving forward. I know that I can't wait to meet in person. I've got my second business trip next month since March of last year, which is unprecedented, unheard of. I normally would have gone on no less than 30 by now. And I miss travel. I miss the opportunity to engage people. I miss the opportunity to engage people from a global perspective, and for them to learn more about Washington, D.C., American culture, me as an individual, me as a Black individual, because I guarantee, as when I travel globally, they have their own perceived notions of being Black in America based on either what they've seen in movies or what they see in the news. Yep. And I like being an ambassador to give people a different perspective on the Black community in America, recognizing that all Black people in America are not African Americans. They could be Africans that grew up in Belgium that live in the U.S. So that is what I'm really looking forward to, Eric. It's getting back to normal, getting back to the business of being ambassadors for the city and for the U.S. as a whole.
Awesome. Elliot, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Anytime, Eric. Anytime you ask, I'll be there.
Thank you.
All right, my friend.
Thank you, Elliot, for sharing our experience and for a fascinating conversation about diversity and inclusion. Education and awareness are really essential, and I'm very hopeful when I see the next generation. If you want to get in touch with me, please reach out on LinkedIn or join my Facebook group, www.evenbusinessformula.com/group, where we discuss everything related to the business of meetings. Thank you.